The Alps have been called the playground of Europe, a haunt of artists and philosophers, of poets and those whose greatest love is to be amongst the beauties of nature. But the Alps can also offer sterner stuff for the adventurer, a challenge to the climber, the irresistible lure of steep snow to the skier, the glorious sense of freedom from everyday trivialities. Thus, each year to the Alps comes the cream of Europe's long-distance competition motorists, to pit their skill and courage and the power and reliability of their machines against whatever the mountains may have in store. For the International Alpine Rally enjoys a reputation second to none in the world calendar of motoring events. Because of this, the manufacturers use the Alpine as a public proving ground for their products. Because of this, a team of 5 MG A-type coupes was entered for the event in 1956. There's John Milne's car with Douglas Johns in the co-driver's seat. Hard on their heels comes that experienced Alpine driver, John Gott, the team leader, partnered by Ray Brooks. Bill Shepherd and J.R. Williamson are also familiar names in the big events. But none of these drivers are better known nor more universally popular than Mrs. Nancy Mitchell and her partner, Pat Fakeney. At 6,500 feet, the Pass of Pordoi is typical of a score of similar major passes included in the 2,600-mile route of the Alpine Rally. The course covers every conceivable type of road, including many sections which scare off the most seasoned tourists. And on the Alpine, remember, the average speeds which have to be maintained call for flat-out motoring for most of the time. The roads are not closed for this event, and though traffic in the high Alps is light, it can be embarrassing and needs to be watched for. For 8 consecutive days in 6 stages, including 2 all-night sessions, the battle with the mountains is waged, and the cumulative effect of wear and tear on drivers and their cars has to be experienced to be fully understood. But much of the route this year was in Italy, and the Italians loved their motoring. From Marseilles to Zagreb in Yugoslavia and back, the organizers of the Alpine contrive a route which is mountains, mountains all the way, except for a little gentle motor racing from time to time to keep the boys amused. Cortina d'Ampezzo in the Dolomites was a popular place with drivers in the 1956 Alpine. For 3 nights of the 5, when sleep was taken, Cortina meant rest. But even so, the time for such luxuries was never generous, and a 4 o'clock call was the routine start to another day. John Gott checks the team on parade. Kenneth Best recalls his commando training. Nancy Mitchell finds it a bit early to be gay, and Marcus Chambers, the BMC competitions manager, is there to speed his drivers on their way. Nancy Mitchell, by the way, is more experienced on this event than many of the men, but so far the ladies' prize has always eluded her. She's up against keen competition from some of the finest girls at the wheel in Europe, and this is no place for cracks about lady drivers. John Gott's background as a senior police officer gives him a tidy mind, and that's an asset when you're up against the clock from the moment you enter the guarded car park to collect the car to the time you leave it there again, assuming you survive the rigors of the day. On the Alpine, maximum use must be made of every available straight, and a truly responsive car is a necessity. But now let's watch the activity at a typical control in Italy and see why it takes more than just an ability to drive fast to win an Alpine Cup. In little towns such as this, the Carabinieri are invariably on hand, their attitude generally one of neutral interest. It's the navigator's job to check the time. An error, even one of only a second, can cost an Alpine Cup. A quick getaway can mean several seconds saved, and to achieve this, the car must be moved up to a handy position, and this is by no means always easy in the restricted space available. It's very hot in July in Italy, and to be efficient, the crew must be as comfortable as possible. Milne and Johns take the appropriate action. There's no time for servicing on the road. Everything must be checked in time one at the controls. To drive fast, you've got to be able to see, and dust, mud, and flies don't help. By the way, the age of chivalry is not dead. The ladies must not receive male assistance from their teammates. The sparkling fountain here at Ampezzo, a charming piece of medieval Italy, was to prove remarkably useful on this hot and busy day. But now the 5 or 6 minutes won from the schedule have been used up. The clock ticks up to the minute of departure and the official route card must be stamped. Competitors had to report to each control and time-stamp the card within the appropriate minute. Consequently, if you stamped the card 1 second after the start of that minute, you'd 58 seconds in hand. And that, as every experienced competitor knew, could be extremely useful. The Alpine Rally must surely be the most scenically splendid event in the international motoring calendar. For hundreds upon hundreds of miles, the route weaves a tortuous ribbon through the splendors of Europe's picture postcard paradise. But to the men and women at the wheel, it's hard to recall these places they have seen. Not for them the long vistas of snowy solitude and broken crag. For them, the never-ending curves and hazards of the road ahead. Up through the tree line, past the snow line, not once a day, but sometimes twice an hour. And after the dragging climb, the breathtaking descent, with all that means to the brakes and transmission of an overworked car. And this sort of thing doesn't help when you're tired and pushed for time. Come on now, we've got him? We've not, you know. So it goes on. Steep gradients, steeper drops over the edge, shocking surfaces, narrow roads, and worst of all, the dust. But gradually, the kilometers are hacked away as the day speeds on. Familiar landmarks like the lake at Misurina sweep into sight, and now Cortina is once again only a couple of passes further on. No time for relaxing, for there's often a sting in the tail of the day's journey on the Alpine. But it begins to look as though we've made it on another stage. By the way, that's the last time you'll see the German girls' Taunus intact. They crashed 2 corners up the road, though they themselves were not hurt. But they were by no means the only ones to suffer misfortune. More than half the 74 starters had been penalized or retired at the end of the first 24 hours. To get a car swinging fast through the endless succession of curves on the Alpine requires a fine appreciation of line, precise positioning of the car on every corner to get it into the curve as wide as possible, tight on the apex, and out with maximum acceleration. At the same time, the brakes and tires must be spared within reason, for there's no time to change the linings and covers may not be replaced. Most people carried 2 spares, but even so, those who finished had scarcely a tread between. So John Gott returns to Cortina, although the marks he lost on the first night cannot be recovered. Nancy Mitchell, on the other hand, retains her clean sheet. As ever, the first concern is for the car. No work whatsoever is allowed once it's been checked into the overnight park. And as refueling on the road is a major factor, a full tank is a must before the car is put away. And Marcus Chambers sports an appropriate hat while keeping an eye on the proceedings. Unlike the MG hardtops, which were making their first appearance, some of the cars involved were Alpine veterans. But old or new, big or small, their basic requirements were much the same. The tired crews had little time to meet them, and an error in this routine could so easily spell disaster on the morrow. They're an interesting bunch of folk who follow the Alpine road. There are the buccaneers, like this dusty Dennis Scott. The studious types, like Eddie Pennybacker, the American radio commentator who partnered the cosmopolitan Gatsonitis. The German goes, who arrived at control despite their accident. One by one, they checked in at Cortina for the last time. For ahead lay a change of scene on the 5th stage of the rally. Whichever way you leave Cortina, you find yourself almost immediately involved in a pass. The driver must get quickly into his swing, the navigator must be working at all times just one jump ahead. At first, conditions were comparatively easy on the 5th stage, but conditions change swiftly in the mountains, and the wise driver makes the most of good going while it lasts. This is the road that leads towards the Stelvio. At over 9,000 feet, it's the second highest pass in Europe and a traditional special test on the Alpine course. Not only does it have to be crossed within the usual tight schedule, but most of the ascent to the summit is also a timed climb with a flying start and finish. There's a bogey limit for each class with a loss of marks and an Alpine Cup per second late at the top. But on the other hand, bonus marks may be won for the fastest times recorded. Similar tests had already been held at the Monza circuit and on the Autobahn in Yugoslavia. And here's the control that led to that critical Stelvio section. Crash hats will be worn, said the regulations, to say nothing of common sense, and this was no place to hang around checking watches. Paddy Hopkirk's navigator, Willie Cave, looks tense as well he may. Kenneth Best shows typical MG team spirit with a clear wave to show his driver Jack Sears when to start the watch. These Americans were on their first European event, and it had made a forcible impression. So off to the flat-out attack on the Stelvio, made doubly treacherous by roads as greasy as a skid pan under a drizzle of icy rain. Stretch, 8.5 miles further on and through the cloud to the summit of the Stelvio. Despite the atrocious weather, this is in July, remember, there's a fair-sized crowd at the top, and where else can you look down on a dramatic motoring panorama such as this? The timekeeper checks John Milne at the summit with plenty of seconds in hand, as had all the MG team despite the weather. The flag marshal urged caution, but those who were hard-pressed for time could pay little regard. Nancy Mitchell had some 40 seconds in hand on the bogey time and eased off perceptibly in readiness for the vicious descent. Bill Shepherd, too, made no mistake. At this altitude, the carburation of an engine is tested to the extreme, and after days of running at around 80 in the shade, the temperature here is getting down to freezing point. But now there is the control to reach on the other side of the pass, and even making the bogey time at the top still necessitated a very fast descent to stay on time. Again, the car takes a fearful beating, and it's no exaggeration to say that the lives of the competitors depend on the ability of the machine to stand up to this punishing test. So the 500 miles of the fifth stage were rolled away. More penalties, more retirements. The number of cars which awaited the start of the sixth and final stage from the car park at Megève was 1/3 of the number which started. As the MG team made for their hotel, only Nancy Mitchell and Jack Sears were still clear of penalty points, but all 5 cars were running well. For once, there was a change from the very early morning start. Indeed, arriving at Megève in the late evening, the cavalcade did not restart until some 20 hours later. Nancy and Jack Sears arrived for the start refreshed by their rest and determined to win through to Marseilles to collect a Coupe de Alpes. But the final stage is almost as bad as the first, with 8 major passes in the darkness ahead and a score of controls at which 1 critical second of lateness could dash their hopes. By now, much of the strength of the continental teams was broken, and already, as so often in the past, British cars and crews had proved their superior staying power on the Alpine course. So they went to the final throw against the mountains and the clock. Even in the very closing miles, more hopes were dashed, including those of Jack Sears and Kenneth Best, who crashed early the following morning. Nevertheless, 17 cars were to arrive at Marseilles clear of penalty points, and of these, no less than 9 were British. Of the MG team, it was a clear case of ladies first, and Nancy Mitchell was to receive the honors of the Alpine Rally for which she had striven so valiantly in previous years. To her, the ladies' prize, and the added distinction of being only the 2nd Englishwoman ever to win a Coupe des Alpes, and to Pat Fakeney, her navigator, a due share of the credit. At the Earls Court Motor Show less than 4 months later, the hardtop MG, as used on the Alpine Rally, made its first public appearance on the stand. Having proved its worth in the rigorous test of international competition of the highest order, the car becomes available to the discerning motorist. Graceful of line, small and pretty, and at the same time offering everything demanded by the keenest motoring enthusiast. An important addition to the range of the British industry, designed to beat the world, the Series A MG Coupe, a worthy successor to a long line of famous cars.